Herrn Hühn aus Hamburg und Ralf Hertel aus Trier zur Präsentation ihres wunderbaren Buches, zu dem jetzt die beiden selber etwas sagen.
Thank you for having us here again. We came here 2 years ago, a bit more than 2 years ago, to present the same project when it was still a work in project. And we're glad to say, and we're proud to say that the book now is available in print and has been available in print for a couple of months, actually. And yes, this is it. And this is what we're going to talk about today. And we'd like to draw your attention to this book because we know you're all interested in poetry, so we hope it's not presumptuous to talk about the book we published very recently. Now, what we want to do today is the following. I'll say a few words about the structure of the book, the general setup of the book, and then essentially we'll look at 2 chapters of this book, 2 close readings, 2 interpretations, 2 poems. 1, early modern. This is what Peter is going to present to us. And then briefly, a more recent example, which I'm going to talk about. So brief introduction and then 2 close readings, 2 sample chapters. So first of all, what's the book about? And well, perhaps I can just share my screen here. Can you all see this? Does that show on your screen? So this is what the book looks like. And the title says it all. This is about English poetry in context. Perhaps this needs a bit of explanation. English poetry, what we're dealing with in this book is not just poetry by English poets, but also by Welsh writers, by Irish writers, Northern Irish writers, Scottish writers mostly. So we're dealing with Anglophone poetry in, well, yeah, Anglophone poetry, but not US American, for instance, not Canadian poetry, not what we would call New English literatures. So we'll focus on the poetry from the British Isles and Ireland mostly. We do have a few authors who come from outside the British Isles, but generally speaking, we focus on the British Isles, Britain and Ireland. Not because we think that there is a lack of interesting poetry outside of the British Isles, but rather on the contrary, because there is so much interesting poetry that we couldn't cover it all, really. This book is 400 pages already. And if we wanted to include all the Anglophone literatures, we'd have to write a second book, really. So the focus is very much here on British and Irish writers. Okay, the aim of the book is to provide a first stop for people interested in English poetry. So this is not a book geared towards experts in the field, but the idea is to provide a book for people who are interested in poetry, but who are not necessarily experts in poetry. Teachers, for instance, students, undergraduate, graduate students. And yeah, so what we do is we provide a sort of overview of English poetry from the 16th to the 21st century. You can read this as a history of the genre if you wish. You can also pick specific periods or specific authors. What we don't do in this book is we don't provide very specialist readings of very specific issues and questions, but rather a first orientation for people who just want to know more about English poetry. And what we do is we read individual poems before their historical ideological background. And the idea is to make the 2 reflect upon each other. So we have close readings of individual poems and we have contextual information. And yeah, the idea is that knowing the context will help you understand the poem, but also individual poems can function as keys, if you wish, to specific periods. So if you look closely at the text, not just what it talks about, but also how it is written, you will learn something valuable about the period it was written in. In terms of method, what we're doing is a close reading. The book is really based on more or less 50 close readings of poems and additional contextual information on the period, on the poets. And perhaps I'll just show you the structure of the book with the help of the table of contents. I'm not sure, is that too small? Perhaps I can zoom in a bit. So this is what the table of contents looks like. By the way, it's in the library as well, if you want to have a closer look. So we have 5 periods. We divided the large field of English poetry into 5 periods, starting in the 16th century, the early modern period, and ending in the 21st century. And what you get in these individual chapters is, first of all, a historical introduction to the period. So for instance, there is an introduction to Tudor poetry. There's an introduction to the Elizabethan period, or say to the poetry of the Civil War. So you'll get the historical background. You'll then get information on the individual authors, say Sir Thomas Wyatt. And then you get the poem itself, Who's Ulysses to Hunt in this case, and a close reading of this poem. And this is rounded off with further reading suggestions. So essentially, you can read this book as a history of English poetry, as a sort of mapping out of the large field that is English poetry. You could also focus on a specific period. Say, if you're teaching Romanticism, you could use that chapter on Romanticism as a first introduction. Or you could also look for your favorite poems and just read a close reading of this poem to get some inspiration as to how to interpret this specific poem. I should add that the book we publish now is based on an earlier book by Peter Hühn, which was published in the 1990s with UTB. We have it in the library as well, a history of English poetry in German. A very, very good book, a very helpful book, long out of print. So we decided to update this original version, bring it up to date to the present day, translate it into English. So we took over a couple of chapters from this original book, translated them into English, and we added a couple of new chapters. And personally, I found Peter's original book very helpful in teaching poetry to my students. And this is why I wanted to do this project with you, Peter, and this is why I'm glad we did this. Because I'm teaching a seminar which is called A History of English Literature in Selected Poems. So we select 12, 13 poems representing their specific periods, and we look at these poems by doing close readings. And the close readings provided in our book here might serve as a starting point for stimulating discussion in the classroom. So if you're into teaching, perhaps this might be handy for you. So much for the general setup of the book project. Peter, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think a perfect introduction and the perfect overview of everything you can expect from the book. Just one technical suggestion. Can you remove the frame from the PowerPoint presentation so that the panel itself is a little larger?
Yeah, actually that wasn't the PowerPoint presentation yet, but we shall come to the PowerPoint presentation right now. And it looks like this, and let's see.
Okay.
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, that's better. That's
okay,
perfect.
Okay, right. So yes, so we come to the second part, after these preliminaries, and these are 2 chapters from this book. The first one is on an early modern example, a poem by George Herbert, and Peter is going to talk about this in a moment, and then I'll follow up with a brief interpretation of a more recent poem by John Agard. So Peter, would you want to take over? And
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction. And Ralph will always move the panel so that you can see the text, but you can also see at the beginning a picture of the poet, George Herbert. And could you move this on? Yes. To exemplify the approach to the history of English poetry, I will now take as an example a poem from the 17th century, sketching first the poetological context and then presenting the poem itself and its analysis. I'll do this in a somewhat condensed and simplified version in comparison with the book itself. Around 1600, a new era of English poetry began, an innovative departure which is associated with the impetus to new developments in other social and cultural fields, such as philosophy, science, and politics. The outstanding representative of this new departure in poetry is John Donne, whose poetry is characterized by new stylistic devices. Bold choice of images, concise diction, harsh rhythms, colloquial phrases, dramatic conversational situations, and the pronounced intellectuality of what was called wit. Donne's poetry found numerous successors who are subsumed under the misleading term metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical was applied by later critics on account of Donne's choice of images taken from areas regarded as unpoetic, such as astronomy, theology, and scholastic philosophy, a term meant to be derogatory. Donne and the other metaphysicals were discredited from the late 17th century into the 19th century. After the end of the 19th century, a new appreciation of the metaphysicals set in. And the literary modernists, especially T.S. Eliot, saw Donne as an important model for their own conception of poetry on account of the common interest of modernists and metaphysicals in experience and the identity and orientation of the self as a poetic subject. Religious themes in poetry are relevant because religion plays a crucial role in the constitution of the individual's identity. The religious poetry of the metaphysicals is of particular interest insofar as the transcendental certainties come under pressure during the 17th century owing to spiritual, social, and political upheavals and denominational controversies. As a result, the individual's recourse to the transcendental world as a stable point of reference becomes precarious, unstable. The stylistic and rhetorical features of the speaker's utterance to God are similar to those found in the secular poems of Donne. There's, however, a fundamental difference between the love poetry and the religious poetry of the metaphysicals. While in love poetry, the male self, mostly male self, of course, is defined through a mutual relationship with another human being of principally equal rank. In religious poetry, the ego is confronted with an absolute entity on which his entire existence depends. Most metaphysicals dealt with both secular and religious themes, but some authors devoted their creative activity exclusively to religious poetry. Outstanding among those is George Herbert, who lived from 1593 to 1633. Herbert came from an old noble family. He first aimed at a worldly career, seems to have been disillusioned about the political world, and changed his plans in favor of an ecclesiastical career. He finally became rector, that is priest, in a small community in southeast England. His fame is based on the collection The Temple, or Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations. Title and subtitle of this collection point to the connection between the public and private aspects of Christian life, referring on the one hand to the collective institution of the church and the other to the spiritual experience of the individual. Herbert's emphasis on the individual experience can be seen in the poem The Collar. Now, could you move yes. The Collar. I struck the board and cried, no more, I will abroad. What? Shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines and life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, as large as store. Shall I be still in suit? Have I no harvest but a thorn to let me blood and not restore what I have lost with cordial fruit? Sure, there was wine before my sighs did dry it. There was corn before my tears did drown it. Is the year only lost to me? Have I no bays to crown it? No flowers, no garlands gay? All blasted, all wasted? Could you move the next panel? Not so, my heart, but there is fruit, and thou hast hands. Recover all thy sigh-blown age on double pleasures. Leave thy cold dispute of what is fit and not. Forsake thy cage, thy rope of sands, which petty thoughts have made, and made to thee good cable, to enforce and draw and be thy law, while thou didst wink and wouldst not see. Away, take heed, I will abroad. Call in thy death's head there. Tie up thy fears. He that forbears to suit and serve his need deserves his load. But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methoughts I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my lord. And yes, Herbert plays down the religious theme through the colloquial tone and the common human topics of conversation. The speaker relates the experience of a fundamental crisis in his life and its final resolution in the form of a retrospective narrative in the past tense. The poem sets in with the speaker's vehement complaint about his restrictive situation and leads from this spirited rebellion abruptly and without explanation to submission in the end. The central element of this narrative consists of a soliloquy framed by a narrative opening and two closing lines. Within this soliloquy, the speaker is split into two voices addressing each other so that the soliloquy turns into an inner dialogue. These two voices interact with each other to overcome the restrictions experienced by the speaker. The complementary nature of the two voices manifests itself in the division of the dialogue into speech and counter-speech of equal length, 16 lines each, 1 to 16 and then 17 to 32. The former part, lines 1 to 16, contains questions. The latter, lines 17 to 32, the corresponding answers and requests. The dominant personal pronoun of the first person, I, my, me, in the first part is opposed in the second part by thou, thy, and thee. The voice speaking the first part can be identified as the heart, that is the emotional component of the human psyche. The voice in the second part as worldly reason and will. Their interaction consists in the heart expressing emotional dissatisfaction with its situation, while reason draws clear conclusions and calls for decisions. The congruence of heart and reason culminates in the repetition of the phrase, I will abroad, first in line 2 and then in line 28. The resolution of their argument coincides also on a formal level. Metrically, the agreement is expressed in the resumption of rhymes, partly in the form of identical words. For instance, abroad and road, line 2 and line 4. Abroad and load in line 28 and 32. Me in line 13 is reflected in thee and see in line 23 and 26. Suit is then answered by fruit. Suit in line 6 is answered by fruit in line 9, and fruit and dispute in line 17 and 20 also correspond to each other. The visual language employed characterizes the particular quality of the speaker's crisis. The poem opens with a gesture of impatient rebellion. I struck the board and cried, no more. Board is table. The dissatisfaction is then specified as a mixture of lack and coercion. Lack is illustrated by harvest metaphors of wine, grain, and fruit in the lines 7 to 12. Added to this is bodily and psychological suffering, evoked in metaphors of physical injury, as in, but a thorn to let me blood, lines 7 and 8, or of mental pain and depression, as in, shall I ever sigh and pine, in line 3, my sighs in line 11, my tears in line 12, and my sigh-blown age in line 19. Furthermore, there are images of bondage and imprisonment in phrases such as thy cage, line 21, thy rope and cable in line 22 and 24, and thy law in 25. Direct references to such a feeling of restriction are noticeable at the beginning, when the heart desperately tries to assure itself of its freedom. My lines and life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind. Shall I be still in suit? Lines 4 to 6. And this feeling of captivity eventually gives rise to the strong wish to break out, expressed in the striking phrase, I will abroad. With the help of reason, the speaker realizes that the causes of his intolerable situation lies within himself. Forsake thy cage, thy rope of sands, which petty thoughts have made, and made to thee good cable, to enforce and draw and be thy law, while thou didst wink and wouldst not see, lines 21 to 26. Thus, through the rational analysis of his feeling of frustration, the speaker realizes that his misery is merely imagined and self-inflicted, and that he can therefore free himself by a deliberate change of attitude. By seeing through dissatisfaction as an illusion, as a rope of sands, in this very graphic image, one is set free and can fulfill oneself. Suit and serve his need, line 31. The self-concept expressed here emphasizes the autonomy of the individual and the possibility of self-determination and self-fulfillment. Such an act of self-liberation is made possible by rationality, the capacity to detect the real state of affairs, as well as by the decisive will to act. This is a decidedly secular, modern concept oriented towards the here and now of this world. Compare the line, call in thy death's head, in line 29, which is the turn away from a transcendental perspective, and towards the human, be thy law, in line 25. In sum, it appears as a distinctly enlightened stance and can roughly be compared with Immanuel Kant's definition of enlightenment. Despite this overtly secular orientation, the poem has a decidedly religious meaning. This is implied in rather inconspicuous way by the framing elements of title and conclusion, and becomes most obvious in the closing lines, methoughts I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my Lord. Here the inner dialogue of the speaker with himself changes into an actual dialogue with another interlocutor who is unambiguously identified as God by the liturgical form of address, my Lord. The complementary terms child and my Lord define the relation between the speaker and God as one of absolute subordination. Interestingly, this is not substantiated by any argument, but merely evoked as a conventional role model to how to conceive of the relationship between human beings and God. Addressing the speaker as child, God ascribes to him immaturity and dependence, and reminds him of this childlike status in the tone of admonition. The speaker immediately accepts this role, addressing God in turn as Lord, underlining the intimacy of their relation by the possessive pronoun my Lord. Like the previous reflections, this utterance is located within the speaker's consciousness. Methoughts I heard, indicating that God speaks to human beings in the medium of their own consciousness. Thus, the relationship to God is characterized as a private, intimate experience, as a relationship between the individual in its subjective interiority and God. The title of the poem, The Collar, contains a further indication of its religious meaning. The term collar is ambiguous. First, it is a homophone to choler, spelled C-H-O-L-E-R, that is rage, anger. A word with the same pronunciation but a different meaning. The title thus refers to the speaker's angry and rebellious stance. I struck the board, he says in line 1, and I raved and grew more fierce and wild in line 33, which is an expression of choler, rage. Second, collar may refer to the collar of a dog, restricting freedom and forcing into submission. Finally, collar points towards the collar on the priest's robe. This form of collar also implies a lack of freedom, but of a freedom voluntarily given up, as the priest chooses the renunciation of worldly abundance and joy. The religious meaning of title and poem as a whole thus suggests this necessity of turning away from the world and subjecting one's will to the rule of God. Apart from the Christian context of the collection, the collar thus gains its religious meaning only through the framing elements of title and conclusion. In a surprising twist, the last two words of the poem signal that the entire poem has to be understood in a religious context. Here, Herbert reverses the message of the poem in retrospect and invites the reader to reread it in order to translate its meaning onto another dimension. The images are now to be read as an expression of the clergyman's dissatisfaction with the constraints of his task, and generally of the believer with the demands of his faith, his Christian faith. The speaker appears first to be tempted by the world in lines 1 to 16, and second by enlightened rationality in lines 17 to 32 to turn away from the transcendent realm. In other words, the poem can be understood as a text about the seduction of the Christian mind by the modern rationalistic human will to independence. This aberration, the poem implies, can, however, be overcome by the mere appeal to the religious identity of the speaker. The tension between worldly and spiritual attitudes is constitutive. These two attitudes are separated and arranged successively. The striving for autonomy dominates the major part of the poem, especially in the self-confident voice of the rational mind. But at the end, it is taken back and replaced by submission to God. This submission finally takes place without any signs of resistance. Despite worldly temptations, Herbert's speaker is clearly oriented towards the world of faith. In thematic terms, such a radical orientation towards the individual subjective process of experience is generally characteristic of the metaphysicals. In formal and stylistic terms, one can often observe an unusual poetic mediation of the religious theme, endowing concrete images with hidden Christian meanings which reveal their full significance only retrospectively. A further common feature is the combination of straightforward everyday diction with a complex metrical construction, into which I have not been able to go. For instance, interlocked rhyme scheme, variation of line lengths. This coupling of unrestrained informal language and intricate, highly regulated poetic form in terms of sound and metrics reflects on a stylistic level the tension between the individual's striving for independence and his subjection to a higher divine authority, which is central to many metaphysical poems. At the same time, of course, this tension crucially contributes to their sensual appeal. Yes, so much for this poem and its context.
Right, thank you, Peter. So this is our first sample. I'll continue with a second example from our book, a second poem, and then perhaps we can take questions or comments together afterwards. Now, I know we all had far too many long Zoom sessions over the last 2 years, so I'll try to be brief, but nonetheless, I would like to at least very briefly present you with a glimpse of a very recent poem, just to show you the wide variety of poems we deal with when we talk about English literature. And this is a poem by John Agard, born 1949, born in British Guyana, or Guyana today, a former British colony in South America. He migrated to Britain in the 1970s, and he's often seen as a representative of immigrant writers, immigrant poets. And indeed, his poems are very often about the struggle to cope with arriving in a new place, blending, fitting into a very specifically English culture. Agard has been a rather successful writer. He won a couple of very prestigious prizes. He won the Queen's Gold Medal for poetry. His texts are set texts for school examinations in Britain, for GCSE exams and so on. So yes, he's certainly one of the most prominent immigrant voices in Britain today. Now, I picked a poem called Listen, Mr. Oxford Don, which is also a chapter in the book. And rather than me reading this out to you, I'd have John Agard read it out to you. We have a recording of Agard reading his, rather performing his own poetry. And I'll see if that works here. Let me know whether you have sound with it. Otherwise, raise your hand and I'll just start again. Let's see.
Me not know Oxford Don.
Is there sound with it?
Me a simple immigrant from Clapham Common. I didn't graduate, I immigrate. But I warning you, Mr. Oxford Don, I'm a man on the run, and a man on the run is a dangerous one. I have no gun, I have no knife, but mugging the Queen's English is the story of my life. I don't need no axe to split up your syntax. I don't need no hammer to mash up your grammar. I warning you, Mr. Oxford Don, I'm a wanted man, and a wanted man is a dangerous one. Them accuse me of assault on the Oxford Dictionary. Imagine a concise, peaceful man like me. Them want me serve time for inciting rhyme to riot, but are taking it quiet down here in Clapham Common. I'm telling you, Mr. Oxford Dunn, I am not a violent man. I only armed with human breath. But human breath is
Oh, where's it gone now? I'm
a
sorry.
dangerous weapon. So make them send one big word after me. I ain't serving no jail sentence. A slashing suffix in self-defense. A bashing the future with present tense. And if necessary, I making the Queen's English accessory to my offense.
Okay, and here's the text. So I hope you could hear him recite and perform his poem. So John Agard, listen, Mr. Oxford Don. Did you understand what it's about? I know most of us are not native speakers here, and then this isn't the Queen's English, obviously, and on purpose it's not the Queen's English. So perhaps just a brief word on the contents. Oxford Don, what is an Oxford Don? An Oxford Don is an Oxford professor at the University of Oxford, perhaps a literature professor, some sort of authority in a way. And he is talking back to this authority with the voice of the immigrant. I didn't graduate, I immigrate. So this is the immigrant speaking back to the authority of the Oxford professor. There's also the Oxford Dictionary mentioned here, and trying to find his own voice. And it is a poem about immigrant experience. In particular, it's a poem about the violent struggle with the English language. And it's a almost physically violent struggle with language here. He talks about assault on the dictionary, of mugging, robbing, if you wish, the Queen's English. He says, I don't need no axe to split up your syntax, to mash your grammar, and so on. So it's a almost physically violent way of dealing with language. Now, this poem, I think, very nicely illustrates and reflects the experience of first-generation immigrants, the struggle to define their identity between the culture they come from and the British, or perhaps rather English culture they want to belong to. The experience of sitting on the fence, straddling two cultures, if you wish. And this shows on various levels in this poem. It shows in the language, first of all. This poem is in English, obviously, the language of the colonizers. Yet, if you look closely, of course, this isn't the Queen's English. Of course, this isn't standard English. There is something happening to language here. There is some sort of patois Creole form employed here, which undermines the use of standard English. This straddling two cultures also shows in the medium. It is a printed poem, yes, but it's very close to oral cultures, the oral culture of the Caribbean here. And it shows in form. This is a poem, yes, and there's a long-standing tradition, of course, of poetry in English, a very venerable tradition of poetry in English. But how noble, how venerable is poetry in the hands, in Agard's hands? In many ways, this is a really bad poem. He makes a lot of things that you shouldn't do. He makes a lot of mistakes, capital mistakes, if you wish. Try, for instance, finding a meter here. I don't know. If you find a meter, let me know. I can't find a meter here. Instead, what you get is, for instance, very prominent spondaic elements, clash of stressed syllables. Just look at the first line. Me not know Oxford Don, me not know Oxford Don. To me, all syllables are stressed here with the exception of Ford and Oxford. So you have a clash of not just two stressed syllables, but a lot of stressed syllables clashing here. This is, well, what traditionally speaking you don't do in poetry. This isn't I wandered lonely as a cloud and so on, but this is violent here and you can hear it. Try defining the rhyme scheme. And again, I don't think you'll manage, at least I don't. I can't see a scheme here. You do have a lot of rhyme, but it doesn't add up to some sort of pattern. If you look at the rhyme, for instance, you find a lot of wrenched rhyme, unreiner Reim in German. So the stress is on the wrong syllable. And perhaps I can just give you an example. For instance, where is it? I don't need, sorry, there it goes. I don't need no axe. Hold on, how do I do this? Here, can you see that? I hope you can. I don't need no axe to split up you syntax. No axe rhymes with syntax. It should be syntax, but you need to pronounce the second syllable, no axe syntax. It's wrong. And you have several such wrenched rhymes. Oxford Don rhymes with Clapham Common when it should be common rather than common, and so on. You have mosaic rhyme. So you have words like dictionary rhyming with phrases or several words, dictionary rhyming with man like me. You have a lot of identical rhymes, so the rhyme words are the same. For instance, here, on the run rhymes with on the run. Later on, you have a wanted man. This is line 19, is a wanted man. Breath rhymes with breath. What a poor poet. Does he not know any rhyme words? Can he not come up with something that rhymes with run and breath? So in terms of rhyme, there is, traditionally speaking, some really bad rhyming here. Look at the rhetoric devices, and there are lots of rhetoric devices here, but a prominent one is katakrisis, that is jumbled images, things yoked together that don't really go together. For instance, mugging the Queen's English. You mug someone in a park and at gunpoint and you want their money, but how can you mug a language? How can you incite rhyme to riot? How can rhyme riot? How can you assault a dictionary? So these are all things that don't really go together. Grammar is wrong. I didn't graduate, I immigrate, when it should be I immigrated, and so on. Punctuation is entirely absent. Instead, what we get is caesurae, sometimes at least. For instance, look at line 15, there's a caesura here, and also line 17. And I don't know, I think we do have native speakers here, don't we? There was Jonathan Culler here, I can't see just now. But to me, this the caesura seems to amount to some sort of very rude gesture, up you syntax, up you grammar. This reminds me very much of an up yours invective, a very rude expression, which would translate something like "Leck mich am Arsch" in German, and the caesura highlights this rude gesture here. So in a word, what you get here is in many ways a really bad poem, a really a poem that violates many of the rules of how to write poetry. But, and this is a but with capital letters, but this is exactly what makes the poem interesting. This bad poem, if you wish, is, to our mind, the perfect lyrical form to describe a problematic life. The sound is harsh, yes, well, perhaps so is the life of the speaker. The rhythm is irregular, the rhythm is unpredictable, well, perhaps so is the speaker's life, perhaps so is the life of the immigrant in many ways. The rhyme is second rate. Well, what does rhyme do? Rhyme creates coherence, rhyme creates harmony, but then perhaps the life of the speaker isn't harmonious, doesn't cohere, and it would be wrong to have a perfectly rhyming poem to express a life that is characterized by ruptures rather than by harmony. The poem is lacking all punctuation, all sentence structure. Well, perhaps so does the life of the speaker here, lacking order and structure. So if everything is in a way wrong about this poem, perhaps this is what makes it right. The violence the speaker does to meter, to rhyme, to syntax, the violence the speaker does to language, in short, mirrors on a verbal level the violence experienced by the immigrant. And in order to describe a life that is outside of law or social acceptance in many ways, perhaps you need a language that is outside the laws of traditional poetic forms. So we believe this makes this poem particularly interesting. This makes it a great poem, and also in a way representative, at least for Agard's generation of immigrant writing. And this is the first phase of immigrant writing in the 70s, the 80s. You can literally hear the struggle to come to terms not just with a foreign culture, but also with a foreign language and the physicality of dealing with this language. This is something that we believe is, this is something you often find in writers of the first generation. Things have changed. If you look at immigrant poets of the second and third generation, I think their perspective has changed. It's no longer the question, how do I fit in here? But rather, how do we conceive of an English society that includes immigrants like us? So not so much what do we have to change, but how does society have to change to include us? Final word on the poem, perhaps, apart from the text discussed here, and we discuss it in much more detail in our chapter, what we find particularly interesting here is also the performative dimension. This is not just a poem about immigrant experience, but it's very much a script for the voice of the immigrant speaking himself. It is an act of prosopopoeia, if you wish, of giving voice to the immigrant, a gesture, a performative act, doing what it talks about, making the immigrant heard. All this is discussed in more detail in the book, and perhaps I'll just stop here, but this very brief glimpse shall suffice to give you an impression of the wide range of poetry in English there is, and thus of the wide variety, the wideness of the field we cover in our book. So, well, thank you for your patience, and we're very happy to take any questions or responses. Okay, are there any questions? Or Henrike, you want to moderate, or?
Perhaps I should moderate. Thank you both. It was really impressive and wonderful. Are there some questions? I think Nele has the first question, please.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Sorry for intruding in your group, but I'm very happy to be here. Ralf, as you were speaking, I was thinking of so many things. Especially about what you said about prosody and the performance of John Agard's poem, really. So I'm interested in two things. One, where you perhaps see the relation to dub poetry, and two, where you see or how you would evaluate the use of irony and humor in a kind of writing back or speaking back that Agard is after, perhaps, in the poem. if that makes any sense.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, certainly there is a clear connection to dub poetry here. Dub poetry as a specifically Caribbean form of poetry, which indeed Agard is often said to represent. And tellingly, he often performs not just with his voice, as in the recording we've seen, but also with drums, steel pans, and other musical instruments. So yes, certainly Agard would fit into this category of dub poetry. And in a way, there's something lacking if we just look at the poem on the page. The performative aspect is absolutely crucial to his poetry. And tellingly, if you look at his collected works, it comes with a DVD, because he implicitly suggests that, well, you know, don't just read my text, they're written to be performed, and here are the performances. So yes, dub poetry is absolutely crucial here. Irony also is, and I think you get a glimpse of this in this brief performance of his already, you know, peaceful man like me, the assault on the dictionary, how could that be? I'm not quite sure what role it plays. Perhaps irony comes in as a tool of empowerment of those who don't have power. Through irony, you create some sort of distance to your own situation and elevate yourself above the struggle you're fighting, and you look in on where you are from the outside. So I could imagine this is a strategy of taking a step back and sort of self-empowerment. But this is a road we didn't go down in the interpretation in the book, because this is just a sort of first interpretation. But yes, if you wanted to continue this discussion, that would be interesting to pursue.
Yes, thank you. Nele, is this answered for you? Okay. These slashes, Ralph, in the poem, are these slashes a sign for intonation? And that's a question to continue on Nele's question.
You mean the caesurae?
Yes, there are some slashes in various lines.
Yeah, line 15, for instance, to split up your syntax, to mash up your grammar. When you see and listen to him perform, you realize that he indeed uses these as signs for enunciation. He sort of has a break in there when he performs this poem. He says, okay, I don't need no axe to split up you syntax, don't need no hammer to mash up your grammar. I think it's a way of visualizing what he says. You know, I break apart your language, and here it is, and here you even see it on the page.
Okay, so thank you. There's some more questions. First, Matthias, then Daniel, please.
Hang on a minute. Yes, I can't see myself in the panel, so oh yes, now that's fine. Thank you very much. Well, firstly, thank you very much for that very impressive and very constructive publication indeed. And my question is actually on how did you define contemporary poetry, or how did you make your choices? I mean, this is you had to be very strict, because even in the British Isles, there are many excellent contemporary poets. And some of them, I see you've left out, but you had, considering your publication spans 400 pages, you have to make choices. How did you make those choices?
Peter, you want to answer, or shall I answer?
Yes, maybe I maybe try to give a first answer. On the one hand, we geared our selection to what is in the canon. This goes especially for older centuries. We took also some neglected writers, but mainly we also chose those which are considered canonical in Britain. And I think that is legitimate to do that, because we want to represent what is being read and appreciated there. If you come to the recent decades, this becomes more and more difficult, of course. And then there is a choice one has to take, the personal choice. On the other hand, even John Agard is, I think, in the meantime, he is canonical. You find him in anthologies. So it is not so unusual to select him and this particular poem.
Mm. And but I mean, Matthias, thank you for the question. Indeed, this is a very difficult question. How do you choose poems? And I just share the screen here so that you see what we cover in terms of recent voices, and since our Second World War. This is particularly difficult there, but as Peter said, one criteria was to find canonical poems, because we're addressing teachers. We hope that teachers will bring this to school. Also, they need to be short. We don't have The Wasteland in there with 30 pages. So a whole set of criteria, but eventually as we reach the present, it's personal choice mostly, really.
But these are canonical poets anyway, I think. But there was one I did ask the same question to David Morecambe. It strikes me there are no Welsh poets, no contemporary Welsh
Dylan
poets.
Thomas. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'd count
he's
Dylan
dead.
Thomas. Well, he's dead. Yes.
Yeah.
Contemporary Welsh poets living. I'd have to think about this, Peter.
It's an unfair question.
Ask Thomas.
Aris Thomas, indeed.
Yeah.
I miss him.
And it's a question of choice. And there is, of course, to a certain extent, it is. You have to choose something, and by doing that, you leave other things out.
Yeah. And these are obviously excellent choices. They're all canonical, and you have to stop at 400 pages.
Yeah. And we were very lucky to have 400 pages.
Yeah, indeed. Your original book, Peter, came in 2 volumes because it was too long, and the
800 pages. Yeah.
The Schmidt Verlag was very nice, saying, okay, we'll have 1 big volume, and that's it. Yeah, but yes, I mean, most of the poems are canonical, also for the reason that we hope that people who are not experts in poetry will know a couple of the more popular poems and perhaps feel incited to look up our interpretation. And if they find a specifically well-known name and they find the interpretation there, that might be the starting point for them to then read more and read other less canonical poems as well.
I think one motive would also be to select poems which are also being read in Britain, so that we don't make a particularly idiosyncratic German choice. But it is also important, I think, to mediate certain attitudes, certain choices which are common, more or less common in Britain.
Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Now, Daniel.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a great endeavor you took up there. And I just have 2 questions that pertain more or less to history. There's one question for each of the 2 speakers. So one about the first poems. So you interpreted it, among other things, as a reflection upon hardships that a clergyman would have to endure. And well, I wondered how hard the life of a priest of the Anglican Church would have been considered around the time the poem was written. So you already had the abolition of enforced celibacy lifestyle, but maybe it wasn't exactly as we know it from like Jane Austen's novels, that those clergymen were just members of the aristocracy who found some source of steady income and who were rather privileged and also quite integrated in the larger scheme of life, with perhaps its pleasantries. So that would be my question about the first poem, and then towards the second poem, I wondered how much these irregularities, which Ralph you apostrophized as bad poetry, were considered that bad or irregular in the time of the poem. For me, as a German 21st century poet, it's not such a big deal that there is no regular meter, or that there is no rhyme scheme. It might be rather strange that there are rhymes at all. One might want to indeed avoid them, especially in German poetry. So what kind of normative view of poetry was there at the time of the creation of the poem that was strong enough to be a worthwhile target for this deconstructive thrust of the poem?
Okay. Shall I begin? Okay, this is a point, of course. You are right. Priests in the Anglican Church, there were various levels. One was called a rector, and he was very well off. And very often he did not even fulfill his duties, but he had some person who did it for him and who was paid by him. This was then the vicar. This aspect, I think, of the poem is not the main aspect. I think what is interesting in the poem is the clash between a worldly view and a very advanced, as it were, secular worldly view, which came into being in the 17th century and later on, of course. And the clashes between this attitude, which is new, which is religious, which is motivated by rationality, etc., and self-fulfillment and autonomy, and then the Christian view of the worthlessness of everything worldly, and that is the clash, I think, which we have in this particular poem. And on one level, this is also, as it were, the position of the priest, and one would come to this conclusion mainly with respect to the title. The collar clearly refers to that, but it doesn't only refer to that, but it refers also to the dog. And then there is also the notion that that man, the human being, has to be controlled. Otherwise, he would slip the collar. So it is a kind of suppression of worldly needs and worldly wishes. And that is, I think, is the main point. It's not just, the poem, I think, is not meant to create pity and sympathy for the priest. That is just one additional, not a very important aspect of it, I think. It is really the crash between the two attitudes, the Christian attitude on the one hand and the new modern worldly attitude, which came into being, especially in the 17th century, and more in Britain than in other countries.
And with regard to your second question, you're absolutely right. I mean, from our point today, this doesn't seem to be terribly surprising that you don't have a proper rhyme scheme, that you don't have a proper meter. This has become the norm, if you wish. I totally agree with you. I'm not quite sure whether this is the same case for Agard writing 50 years ago. Perhaps norms were still more dominant than they are today. But on the other hand, even in the 70s or the 80s, I think you would have a strong tradition of breaking norms outside of Agard's poetry, of course, as well. So in a way, yes, this is not entirely new, and he's not the first one to do. You could actually trace this tradition of breaking norms all the way back to Shakespeare, Sonnet 130, where he takes up Petrarchan patterns only to break through these patterns. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, and so on. So in a way, this has always been done, that you take norms only to break them. But I think it gains a specific significance in the context of migration and in the context of Agard's poetry, that he doesn't do this just to show off that, you know, I can deal with the poetics, I can deal with the norms, and I can do better, or I don't adhere to the norms. I think in the context of his immigrant poetry, there's a political message in this, saying that, you know, I give to you in voice and rhythm and sound what you do to me. In a way, I give back on a physical level what I physically experience as an immigrant. So I think there's a long-standing topos of breaking norms, but it does take on a new significance in the context of immigrant poetry. Perhaps we could put it this way.
But it comes into being with the modernists, Pound and Eliot, for instance, who broke with the rules. And so it is the modernist depreciation of conventions.
Yeah, well, I would say it goes back even further. And there is a tradition of taking rules and breaking rules for a purpose, which goes back all the way to Chaucer, even if you wanted to, in many ways. But it's interesting to see when this technique or this strategy becomes prominent. And modernism certainly is a phase where it's very prominent. Immigrant writing perhaps is another mode of writing where it is particularly important. So rather than saying, well, he invented this, I think Agard takes recourse to a tradition for specifically political purposes.
Well, the metaphysicists also broke with the convention, which is the outstanding feature of them, and which is also the reason why they were appreciated in the modernist period. So there are phases in English history, poetic history, where the conventions were depreciated and broken, and others where they were reinstituted.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, next one, Alessandro.
Thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations on the book. So my question is actually related to Matthias one. So I was wondering what guided you when you selected your text, especially as far as earlier periods are concerned. So I assume you went with established canonical authors, but did you try to strike a balance between anthological texts of those well-established authors and texts by them that are not perhaps as well known as they should? Or how did you manage the selection?
Yeah, Peter, please. Perhaps I can just show the table of contents again, so you see what text we picked for the earlier periods.
We, I think, chose both. We chose the canonical authors. We had Shakespeare, of course, and Sidney, and so on, and Herbert and Donne. But we also deliberately chose some authors and some poems which were not part of the canon. For instance, one by Queen Elizabeth, which is not normally in anthologies. Or we chose a poem by Mary Roth, a sonneteer of the Shakespeare period, who is being rediscovered nowadays, but she was not part of the canon either. So we tried to, I mean, the majority of poems and poets we chose were, of course, canonical, but there were also some others. But because of the restriction of space, we were very limited in doing this. We would have liked to have included more uncanonical, non-canonical authors. But we chose a number. For instance, from the Romantic period, we chose Charlotte Smith, who's not normally included in anthologies either.
Yeah, so the idea is to present a mixture of canonical, well-known authors and perhaps some lesser-known authors, in the hope that people will turn to the book because, oh, they know these poets, but then perhaps they are inspired to read on in the same period and they might discover a couple of authors or poets they hadn't come across before.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ore. There are some more questions. This is Nicholas, and after this, Thomas Fliss.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your amazing presentation. I have a little bit more global question. My question is, how do you deal with the theory of poetry in your book? Because in the overview you gave, I couldn't see any special chapter about theoretical questions.
Theoretical questions.
Yeah.
Of course, we had a kind of methodological introduction. We did not really develop a kind of theory of poetry. What we did was, well, this introduction really served as a kind of introduction to how to analyze poetry, to make it possible for students, other readers, to learn how to do it if they haven't done it yet. The other aspect of theory is that we also chose to present the theories of the and the concepts of the poets themselves, which is particularly important for the Romantics. All Romantics really developed a kind of poetic concept, and we presented that. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and also Shelley, and which was something new. Before that, you won't find that. But we also had a brief explanation of the concept of Pope, and so the Romantic concepts were very prominent. In other cases, we did not go into that because that is, I mean, you could also say something about Yeats or Eliot, but that would then really take more space away from the poems. And our main interest were the poems, presenting the poems and making people see what they are about, how you can read and understand them, and how you can enjoy them. I mean, that was also a purpose of this book, or is the purpose of this book.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thomas Fliss.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask, do we know if John Agathe the misspellings and the strange rhythm used in this poem, does it represent just the Caribbean usage of English, or is it a conglomerate of, for example, immigrants from different places?
Well, I'm not a linguist, but yes, I think this is in some ways it is sort of standard Caribbean English. Jamaican English, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's not all idiosyncratic, but it is based on some sort of Caribbean English as it tends to be written. So for us, it looks
and spoken,
yes. So it's not wrong at all. It's just a different form of English. It seems wrong to us from the point of the Queen's English, but that's the whole point, that he is not using the Queen's English. But say the instead of the, and the man on the run is something that is typically Caribbean English.
Absolutely. For instance, the possessive pronoun your doesn't exist. It's just you. So the pronoun you is used in all cases and so on. That is really standard Caribbean.
Yeah, so interestingly, perhaps it does not violate that many rules and patterns, but just sticks to different sets of patterns, linguistically speaking.
Okay, we go on. Angelika?
Yeah, thank you very much from me too. My question goes back to Alessandro's question. Was it by chance that non-classical, non-canonical writers you have shown, they were all women? And what about English-speaking history of literature? Is there a tendency to rewrite the canon and to give more voice women poets?
Yes, certainly.
Because in Russian history of literature, in English speaking, I can see this tendency.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a similar tendency in English literature to discover or rediscover female voices that had been occluded for centuries, if you wish. And when we thought about whom else to include, we thought about, are there female voices that are interesting and that should be included, not just because they're female, but because they open up another perspective on the same period that otherwise will not be taken in account. So for instance, when we talk about the early modern period, we have Shakespeare in, certainly we have other sonneteers in, but we have Queen Elizabeth in as well, who responds and reacts to the very male tradition of writing sonnets from a female point of view. So we didn't set out to rewrite the canon from a feminist point of view, but we do believe that there are gaps in the canon that should be filled. And we try to do this as far as this was possible in such a project, which is geared towards school and teachers and university students.
Okay, is this all, or would you like to answer more, Peter?
Well, I may go back to what I mentioned earlier. Ralph just mentioned Queen Elizabeth, and Mary Roth is one of the sonneteers who is female. And we did not choose these, and Charlotte Smith, because they were female only, but they were interesting other perspectives. And especially in love poetry, in love sonnets, which is has a male perspective. It is very interesting to have a sonnet written from the position of a woman. And we had also Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who also did this. So that was our point. And we considered these writers also on the same level as far as value or quality is concerned as the male writers of the same period. I think in this way we try to substitute, supplement something which could be supplemented.
Okay, thank you. Did you include some passages on lyric theory, Peter?
No, not really. We had this methodological introduction, and otherwise we did not go into that in more detail, because that is not really the point of the book, or not the purpose of the book. It is very practical, as it were, and text-oriented, and context-oriented, text and context-oriented. So that was our main perspective. Otherwise, yeah, to write a theory or to include a theory of poetry in this respect is really would break up the concept of the book as a whole, I think. It would have to be very detailed in order to be valuable at all.
Did you give an outline of the development through the ages? In the summary or something like it?
Yes, in the introduction to the various periods, we gave a kind of overview of how poetry developed, the history of poetry. That is very problematical, of course. We didn't really go into very much detail, but we discussed the way in which Romanticism developed, or Classicism developed, or Modernism developed, etc. So that we did. But the main point was practical and textual.
And wonderful, text-based. Wonderful analysis, thank you.